close your eyes for a moment and let your imagination carry you across the windswept plateaus of ancient Armenia. The stars shimmer quietly above the highlands, and the hush of history settles in like a soft blanket over the mountains. In this stillness, let us travel back not just centuries, but over 2 millennia, to a time when a forgotten king carved out a realm so vast, so ambitious, that it threatened even the might of Rome. This is the story of Tigranes the Great, the King of Kings. He rose from a kingdom that few in the West had heard of, and built an empire stretching from the Caspian Sea to the shores of the Mediterranean. Armenia, often seen as a crossroads of empires, became under his vision and power an empire of its own. Yet, as with all great rulers, his journey was not simple. His story is woven with alliances and betrayals, military triumphs and quiet defeats, unexpected friendships and tragic endings. Through the valleys of war and over the peaks of diplomacy, Tigranes walked a path that would define an entire era of Armenian history. And tonight, as you slowly drift into sleep, we will walk that path with him. In this video, we won't just recount names and dates, we'll relive moments. You'll hear the whispers of the court in Artaxata. You'll feel the rumble of distant cavalry hooves echoing through the Taurus mountains. You'll watch as Rome, Parthia, and Pontus maneuver like pieces on a grand chessboard, while Tigranes dares to play his own game. This journey will be soft and slow, gentle in tone, but rich in imagery. Ideal for a calm night's rest or a moment of peaceful reflection. This is not just history. It's a bedtime voyage into a world that once was. Before we begin, I'd love to know, from where in the world are you watching this story unfold? And what time is it there, as you prepare to drift into sleep, guided by this ancient tale? Leave a comment below. I always read them, and I'd love to know where my fellow dreamers are listening from. And if you enjoy falling asleep to history, consider subscribing for more quiet journeys through the past. Hello, my name is Sherry, and welcome to my channel. Long before the world came to know Tigranes the Great, before his empire sprawled across continents, and his name echoed from the mountains of Armenia to the shores of the Mediterranean, there was simply a land in the shadows. This land, Armenia, was no stranger to history. It had breathed the air of forgotten empires, stood beneath the banners of Urartu, and watched the rise and fall of Assyria and Babylon from the safety of its rugged plateaus. It was ancient even in the days of Rome, a place of whispering winds and highland mists, cradled by the Caucasus and guarded by stone and silence. But by the 2nd century before the Common Era, Armenia was not a land of power. It was a chessboard, and its kings were little more than pieces moved by mightier hands. To the west, the Seleucid Empire, fraying and weary, still cast a shadow. To the east, the Parthian Empire was rising, swift and sharp like a blade. Armenia lay between them, small but stubborn, fractured into provinces ruled by noble houses, each with its own ambitions. The Artaxiad dynasty, to which Tigranes would one day belong, had begun its rule in this fragile space, but their power was tenuous, dependent not on strength, but on careful negotiations and the good favor of stronger empires. The throne could vanish as quickly as it was won, and kings were made as much in foreign courts as they were on the battlefield. Into this uncertain world, Tigranes was born. We don't know the exact moment of his birth. History did not stop to record the hour. But what we do know is that he was born into a court surrounded by tension. His father, Tigranes I, was a client king under Parthian influence. And when the time came, the young Tigranes, perhaps no older than a teenager, was handed over to the Parthians. Not as a diplomat, not as a guest, but as a hostage. It was a common tactic in ancient geopolitics. Hostages from noble families were kept at foreign courts to ensure loyalty. One step out of line from Armenia, and young Tigranes' life would be the cost. It was a brutal but effective kind of insurance. And yet, it was in Parthia, in the heart of a foreign world, that the boy began to understand power. We can only imagine the sights he saw. The glimmering palaces of the Arsacid court, the cadence of the Parthian tongue, the hush of strategy whispered in dark corridors. There, in silence, he watched. He listened. He learned. He was a prince in exile, but one who paid attention. He studied the ways empires survived, how rulers built alliances, how armies were moved like pieces on a grand board. And deep within him, slowly and quietly, a dream began to grow. Not just to return, but to rise. Meanwhile, in Armenia, the throne was beginning to tremble. The region was restless. Parthia eyed the territory with increasing suspicion, and when Tigranes I died, there was no strong heir to challenge the influence of the East. The Armenian nobles, perhaps out of desperation, perhaps out of obligation, appealed to Parthia, and Parthia, seeing its moment, gave them Tigranes. But not without a price. In exchange for the crown, Tigranes was forced to surrender territory. 70 valleys of Armenia's richest lands were handed to Parthia as tribute. It was a heavy tax. Some would call it humiliation, but Tigranes accepted it, not because he was weak, but because he understood something far more important: timing. He returned to Armenia not as a hero, but as a cautious new king. His kingdom was still fragmented, his nobles suspicious. But he brought with him the quiet discipline of a hostage who had survived, and the ambition of a man who had seen what empire looked like from the inside. He would bide his time, he would build, and then he would strike. But those early days were lonely ones. The land he inherited was fragile, exhausted from years of foreign manipulation. Trade routes were insecure. Bandits roamed the eastern borders. The noble families squabbled for influence, each dreaming of carving out their own power. There was no great army, no fortresses to lean upon, just a throne with thin legs and a man with iron in his heart. Still, was something timeless about Armenia itself. The highlands had a way of shaping those who ruled them. The mountains didn't reward the hasty. They respected patience, endurance, the ability to wait for the right moment. Tigranes listened to the mountains. He spent the first years of his reign rebuilding his base, strengthening loyalty through marriage alliances, forging quiet deals with provincial lords, and sending scouts south and west to learn of the movements of Seleucids and Parthians. He was preparing for something. But what exactly remained hidden like a sword kept beneath robes? The people, too, began to speak of him in quiet tones. Some feared his Parthian upbringing. Others admired his composure, but none doubted his presence. There was something different about this king. He was not loud. He did not boast. He moved like a man waiting for the wind to change. And in time it would. But before that wind could turn, Tigranes would need to understand who his enemies truly were. For in the distance, in the western hills, another king was watching him. Mithridates of Pontus, fierce, brilliant, and driven by a hatred of Rome, was gathering strength, and though they had not yet met, their destinies would soon become intertwined. But that is still ahead of us. For now, imagine the torchlit halls of ancient Artaxata, where Tigranes sits late into the night, maps unrolled before him, the cold mountain air slipping through the stone corridors. He says nothing. He simply studies, not as a hostage anymore, but as a king in waiting. And what he waits for will soon shake the world. The corridors of the Parthian court were not built for comfort, at least not for boys like Tigranes. There was grandeur, yes, pillars of white stone, silken drapes catching the desert breeze, guards clad in armor that glimmered under the high sun. But grandeur, in this case, was a costume. Underneath, it was a prison made polite. Tigranes had been taken there not as a noble guest, but as a guarantee, a living promise that Armenia would not stray from Parthian interests. He must have been young, some believe just a teenager, when he left his homeland, barely more than a boy, stripped from the slopes of Mount Ararat and planted in a foreign palace, whose language he did not speak and whose rules he had not written. It was not chains that bound him. It was something worse: expectation, surveillance, pressure to smile, to listen, to nod, but never to speak out of turn, to be the good Armenian, to be quiet, to be loyal. But here, in this gilded cage, the mind of a future king began to sharpen. The Parthians were a powerful people, descended from Persian nobility and hardened by nomadic roots. Their empire was vast, stretching from the Tigris to the eastern mountains beyond reach. They moved like merchants and ruled like warriors. Their kings sat in luxury, yes, but they never forgot the saddle. And in their courtyards, the whispers of politics were carried like arrows in the wind. Tigranes paid attention. He watched how Parthian lords negotiated, how they kept allies close, but not too close, how they elevated and destroyed vassal kings with a single gesture. He learned how armies were not just built from soldiers. but from loyalty, trade, and the slow, deliberate web of marriages and gifts. And slowly, the boy from Armenia stopped feeling like a victim. Instead, he began to feel prepared. The court life, though cold, offered its own kind of education. There were scholars, generals, merchants, and envoys from lands he had only heard of in whispers: Bactria, Media, even far-off India. There were maps drawn in red ink, with rivers like veins and cities like stars. Tigranes absorbed it all. In his quiet hours, perhaps he would walk the palace gardens, eyes drifting toward the east, toward Armenia, toward home. He must have wondered if they remembered him, if his father still sat on the throne, if the mountains still bloomed with spring. But Armenia had changed. Tigranes I, his father, was aging. The nobles were restless again, sensing weakness. Parthia, ever watchful, waited for an excuse to tighten its grip. The Armenian highlands, always wild, began to whisper of rebellion, uncertainty, fragmentation. And far away, the hostage prince simply waited for the world to shift. It did, as it always does. One cold season, word came, Tigranes I had died. The throne was empty, and Armenia, ever the prize, had become unstable once more. The Artaxiads had no strong successor left. No prince but the one kept in Parthia. And so the Parthians, calculating as always, made their move. They offered Armenia its prince back, but at a price. Tigranes was freed, but not as a conquering hero. Not as a son welcomed home with garlands and trumpets. He returned wearing the cost of compromise. Armenia had to cede 70 valleys to the Parthians' fertile land, rich in trade and water, surrendered in exchange for a king. Some say Tigranes never forgave himself for that trade. Others believe he saw it differently, as a necessary wound, one that would eventually heal beneath the armor of empire. He rode back into Armenia, not in triumph, but in silence. He was no longer a boy. His face was leaner, his eyes more still. There was an edge to his voice now, a certain gravity when he spoke that made others pause, even if they didn't understand why. The nobles, skeptical at first, watched him closely. They expected a Parthian puppet, a man softened by foreign luxury. What they found instead was something altogether different. Tigranes had not returned to obey. He had returned to rebuild. And yet, his first actions as king were not rash. He did not punish the nobles. He did not scream about vengeance or glory. He spent his first months listening, visiting distant provinces, offering calm words, arranging marriages, brokering peace between rival lords. He gave the impression of caution, of diplomacy, of a man who would play by the rules. But beneath it all, he was quietly assembling something much more dangerous: confidence. He knew that Armenia could not thrive under foreign yokes, neither under Parthia, nor under the fading Seleucid grip to the west. He saw the way these empires trembled, how they were hollowing out from within. He knew that history always leaves a door open for those bold enough to walk through it. And deep in the highlands, in the quiet places where soldiers whispered and builders sharpened chisels, Tigranes began to plant the seeds of something extraordinary. He would not remain the hostage prince. He would become the king that no one expected. And far beyond his borders, another storm was brewing. Across the Black Sea, in the kingdom of Pontus, another man dreamed of defying Rome. His name was Mithridates VI, and though they had never met, the destinies of these two kings would soon collide in a friendship that would change the map of the ancient world. But for now, Tigranes was home, and though the world still called him Client King, though the valleys he had surrendered still lay in enemy hands, though the Parthians still believed they owned him, he knew better, because when you have once been a hostage, when you've tasted fear and walked its halls, nothing terrifies you anymore. Not enemies, not empires, not even fate. And that is how kings are made. It's a strange thing to inherit a throne not in triumph, but in silence. Tigranes, still bearing the invisible weight of Parthian chains, stepped onto Armenian soil, not with the swelling pride of a conquering hero, but with careful steps, cautious eyes, and 1,000 thoughts behind every word. There were no grand parades, no imperial fanfare, only the watchful stares of noblemen wondering whether the man returned to them was still theirs or someone else entirely. And in truth, even Tigranes wasn't fully sure. The crown was his, yes, but its foundation was fragile. His path to the throne had been paved by foreign favors. He had surrendered valleys, conceded dignity, and returned to a land that questioned his loyalty. Was he a king or a servant of the Parthians? That uncertainty loomed over every meeting, every court session, every alliance. But Tigranes, still young, perhaps not yet 30, did not flinch. He did not deny the reality. Instead, he absorbed it. He wore the past like a cloak. And in the halls of Artaxata, he began to do something few kings ever do in their early years. He listened. He met with tribal leaders in the north and sat quietly through their long, suspicious speeches. He drank thick wine with generals who spoke bluntly of Armenia's weaknesses. He walked among merchants, learning the flow of trade through the mountain passes. He watched the old temples, the harvests, the roads, the coins, and in doing so, he began to understand something his predecessors had missed. Armenia was not weak, it was waiting. The land was fractured, yes. The nobility was quarrelsome, yes. But it was rich. It was high and defensible. It touched every great power without belonging to any. It was a place where armies passed, but where none had stayed. It was a place of origin, a place where something new could begin. So Tigranes began to build, not with walls or swords, at least not yet, but with ideas. First came the quiet centralization. Provincial nobles were drawn into court, not coerced, but tempted. He offered land grants in exchange for loyalty. He married strategically, weaving distant houses into his own. He reshaped the coinage, bearing not the faces of Parthian kings, but symbols of Armenia's own mountain gods, silent but powerful gestures of sovereignty. Slowly, ever so slowly, the image of the king began to change. He was no longer the boy who had returned from Parthia. He was Tigranes, the man of patience, the man who chose when to speak, the man who watched every corner of his realm with unsettling clarity. And across the border, the world began to notice. The Seleucid Empire, once a titan of Alexander's shattered legacy, had become a fractured mirror. Its western pieces fell under Roman pressure, its eastern edges frayed with revolt. Syria, once the jewel of the Hellenistic world, was a house with a fading lantern. Tigranes saw the cracks, and more importantly, he understood their timing. To the east, the Parthians still believed they held influence over him. They thought Armenia would remain a soft buffer between their empire and Roman ambitions. To the west, Rome saw Armenia as little more than a minor kingdom nestled between larger players. Tigranes allowed them to believe these things, but behind the scenes, he began to move. It started with border stabilization. He reorganized the military not as a defensive force, but as a standing army, disciplined and mobile. He imported weapons, trained cavalry, and restructured command under his own loyalists. The tribes of the Armenian highlands, once a source of chaos, were converted into regional militias sworn to the king, not their local lords. Then came diplomacy. Tigranes reached out to discontented cities in the south, those still nominally under Seleucid control, but desperate for protection and prosperity. He offered trade, security, and a promise. Armenia would remember them when no one else would. And in time, those cities began to fall under his banner, not through bloodshed, but through belief. But Tigranes knew the tide would not turn with quiet diplomacy alone. Eventually, a bold strike would be needed, one that would announce Armenia as not merely a kingdom, but a rising empire. That moment came when he laid his eyes southward, into the heart of Mesopotamia. Here lay the lands once ruled by Babylon, then by the Persians, then by Alexander's successors. A cradle of civilization, yes, but by the time of Tigranes, a place of instability. The Seleucid governorates were weak, the satraps corrupt or scattered, and the Parthians, overextended and distracted, had no firm grip. It was a gap in the armor, and Tigranes moved swiftly through it in a series of short campaigns, each planned with surgical precision. Tigranes' armies swept down into northern Mesopotamia. Fortresses were taken, cities pledged fealty. Trade routes came under Armenian control, and for the first time in centuries, the world began to speak the words Armenian Empire. Tigranes did not announce himself as a conqueror. He styled himself as a restorer, a unifier, a man bringing order to lands neglected by failing empires. But in truth, something grander stirred in his heart. He was no longer just wearing a crown. He was beginning to build a legacy. By now, the nobles no longer questioned his loyalty to Parthia because it had become irrelevant. Tigranes answered to no one. His rule extended across lands that had once obeyed Persian satraps and Greek kings. His name traveled along trade routes, whispered in marketplaces from Antioch to Ecbatana. And at the center of it all stood Armenia, no longer a kingdom in the shadows, but something new, something rising. Yet the world was watching, and the gods of history are never silent when ambition grows. Far to the west, Rome was taking note, and in the north, Mithridates of Pontus, a king of equal ambition and greater risk, had begun to reach eastward. It was inevitable that the two would meet, not as enemies, but as mirrors. And when they did, the world would change. A king who dreams alone builds nothing, but a king who knows when to move, when to wait, and when to strike. He reshapes the world. By the time Tigranes turned his eyes toward empire, his early foundations were already set like stone beneath him. Armenia was no longer simply surviving, it was growing, pulsing with something rare in those turbulent times, momentum. The world around him was unraveling. The once mighty Seleucid Empire had become little more than a name. Parthia, distracted by unrest and internal division, could no longer enforce its will along its western front. Rome was powerful, yes, but preoccupied with its Mediterranean wars and the restless republic at home. In this brief, golden sliver of time, the old order had softened. And that, Tigranes knew, was when a new order could be born. The campaigns began not with noise, but with precision. First came Safin, the western Armenian territory that had long resisted full integration. Tigranes brought it to heel firmly, but without bloodshed. He offered its lords something they couldn't refuse: permanence, wealth, and a place within the future he was building. They accepted, and the borderlands shifted. Then came Cappadocia to the west, a kingdom strategically positioned, but too close to Roman interests. Tigranes attempted to extend influence there through diplomacy, even installing a ruler of his choosing. But Rome, always wary of eastern entanglements, responded with warnings. Tigranes backed off for now. It was not the right time. He had learned that from the Parthians. Timing was everything. Instead, he turned south, northern Mesopotamia, the land between rivers, ancient and rich in history, was weakened but still fertile. Tigranes struck quickly, like a storm sliding over the mountains. His army, now well-trained, battle-tested, and fiercely loyal, met little resistance. City after city opened its gates. Some were tired of Parthian taxes. Others welcomed Tigranes as a protector. He didn't destroy, he absorbed. For Tigranes was not just a conqueror, he was a strategist. He offered local rulers autonomy under his crown. He preserved temples, respected customs, and allowed trade to flourish. In doing so, He turned conquered cities into partners, not prisoners. And it worked. Within a few years, the Armenian Kingdom stretched beyond anything it had been before. Assyria, Adiabene, Atropatene, even parts of Media, all came under his rule. But he wasn't done. He had begun to think not just as a king, but as something more. King of Kings. That was the title once held by the Persian emperors, those who had ruled from Persepolis to the edge of the world. To wear that title was not a mere boast. It was a declaration that your throne was higher than others, your crown brighter, your authority layered over subordinate kings like a mountain over valleys. And Tigranes claimed it. In doing so, he sent a message not just to his people, but to his enemies. Armenia was no longer a buffer. It was a power, an empire, and it needed a heart. Artaxata, his inherited capital, was too close to the old world. It was nestled among the mountains, defensible but isolated. Tigranes wanted something new, something grand and symbolic. And so, he began construction on a city that would bear his name, Tigranes. Built from scratch, it was to be the jewel of the East, located in the south, nearer to his new conquests. It symbolized Armenia's transformation from kingdom to empire, from mountain stronghold to global player. He imported architects from Greece, artisans from Mesopotamia, engineers from Syria. Great walls were raised, temples carved from gleaming stone, theaters, markets, courts. It was to be a cultural crossroad, a place where East and West would meet under the gaze of one man, Tigranes. But the price of such dreams is never light. To populate Tigranes, entire cities were emptied. Populations were relocated, some by force, others by promise. It was a common practice in ancient times, but one that sowed resentment. There were whispers of a king who disrupted old lives, who uprooted tradition in favor of glory. Some nobles grumbled. Some priests warned of hubris. Tigranes did not flinch. He believed in what he was building. He had to. Meanwhile, the world watched his rise with quiet unease. To the east, the Parthians, long his reluctant patrons, now saw him as a rival. To the west, Rome noted each conquest with growing concern. But the greatest change was happening to the north. Mithridates VI, king of Pontus, was a man of fire, brilliant, ruthless, and deeply opposed to Roman expansion. He had fought the Republic more than once and survived. His realm bordered the Black Sea, and he dreamed of uniting the Greek East under his rule. But to do that, he needed an ally, a powerful one, someone who understood empire, someone who stood against both Parthia and Rome. He looked east, and there he found Tigranes. The alliance formed between these two kings was not accidental. It was almost inevitable. They were reflections of each other, both products of Eastern resilience, both students of Hellenistic strategy, both men who believed in destiny beyond borders. Mithridates gave Tigranes his daughter in marriage. It was more than a family bond. It was a political signal. East and North were united. Two crowns now faced the western storm, and for a time it worked. Tigranes gained new legitimacy in the Greek world, where Mithridates was seen as a liberator. Greek cities, weary of Roman taxes, looked to the Armenian king with curiosity. Could he be their eastern savior? But alliances, like empires, are living things. They shift, they breathe, and in the quiet moments between their triumphs, cracks began to form. Because Rome does not watch passively, not for long, and as the Armenian Empire reached its greatest size, from the Caspian Sea to the Levant, from the Taurus Mountains to the heart of Persia, Tigranes stood on the edge of his dream. But dreams, too, have shadows, and even as Tigranocerta's walls rose higher and his titles grew longer, trouble brewed on every horizon. The Romans were preparing a response. The Parthians were stirring again, and the very ally who had helped him rise might also be the one to draw him into ruin. But for now, imagine the banners of Armenia fluttering across the desert winds. Imagine caravans arriving at Tigranocerta, rich with silk and gold. Imagine a king standing upon a new balcony, watching a city born from vision, fire, and ambition. This was the peak, and like all peaks, the descent was coming. The wind that brushed across the battlements of Tigranocerta in those years must have carried the scent of triumph. Below, the city pulsed with new life, markets busy with merchants from a dozen lands, courtyards echoing with Greek and Armenian alike, soldiers drilling with shining bronze spears, and temples offering smoke to gods old and new. At its center stood Tigranes, no longer just a king, but something far more commanding. He called himself King of Kings. It was not a title taken lightly, nor did it come without weight. In ancient times, that phrase had belonged to the Achaemenids, the kings of Persia, who once ruled the world from the Indus to the Aegean. It spoke not of mere rulership, but of dominion over rulers. It meant that beneath your crown were others, lesser monarchs, vassals, satraps, who bent their knee to you not out of fear, but because your authority made theirs possible. And Tigranes, by this time, had made it true. He had created an empire where kings once stood alone. In Commagene, Adiabene, Atropatene, and Osrhoene, local rulers remained in place, but now under his watchful eye. Coins minted in their cities bore his name. Tributes flowed not to Parthia, not to Rome, but to Armenia. He sat at the center of a mosaic of power, each piece carefully placed, none large enough to challenge the picture he composed. But titles can be dangerous. They are not just claims, they are invitations. Invitations to envy, to scrutiny, to war. When Tigranes proclaimed himself King of Kings, the message traveled quickly. In the dusty forums of Rome, senators stiffened. They were already weary of Mithridates of Pontus, already entangled in Eastern affairs they never fully understood. But Tigranes, he had, until recently, been a distant figure, exotic, peripheral. Now he was central, a ruler of cities Rome considered part of its sphere, an ally of their most hated enemy, a monarch claiming echoes of Xerxes and Darius. It could not be ignored for long. But Tigranes didn't yet fear Rome. Not truly. He believed himself outside their immediate reach. Armenia was distant, shielded by mountains, unfamiliar terrain, and strong alliances. And so, he continued to act as a true imperial sovereign. He expanded his influence into Syria, a land rich in memory and soil, long since weakened by internal Seleucid strife. In 83 BCE, with the Seleucid line collapsing into irrelevance, Tigranes entered the region, not as a plunderer, but as a liberator. The Greek cities of Syria, long troubled by local wars, opened their gates to him. He established his rule in Antioch, one of the greatest cities of the Hellenistic world. There he treated the Greek elites with respect, allowed temples to remain untouched, and governed with a surprising gentleness. His aim was not destruction, but consolidation. Now he had a western capital. He had the mountains of Armenia, the rivers of Mesopotamia, and the shining stones of Antioch. He was not just a king on a mountaintop. He was the architect of a realm that reached sea to sea. And yet, beneath this astonishing growth, subtle shadows stretched long. Some of his own nobles began to murmur. Tigranes had taken on Greek customs, built a Greek-style capital, married into foreign dynasties. He no longer resembled the mountain lords of old. He was larger than life, and that, to many who preferred the old ways, made him a stranger. Still, no one could deny his accomplishments. The empire flourished, trade routes were protected, the economy boomed. Armenian troops, some native, some foreign, became a force, respected across Asia Minor. But the larger you grow, the more vulnerable your edges become. And on those edges, new tensions brewed. Rome had finally begun to pay attention. The Roman general Lucullus, having fought Mithridates across the northern front, now set his gaze on Tigranes. At first, it was diplomatic. A request was sent: hand over Mithridates, his father-in-law and ally. Tigranes refused. Perhaps he believed Rome would hesitate, that the mountains would protect him, that his army, vast and well-equipped, could repel any incursion. But Rome had grown tired of hesitation, and so Lucullus marched. But that storm is still a few heartbeats away. At this moment in our story, Tigranes stood at the peak of power. His empire, at its greatest extent, stretched from the Caspian Sea to the Mediterranean, from the foothills of the Caucasus to the banks of the Euphrates. It was said that in those days, Tigranes could ride for weeks through lands where only his name was law. He was a king born of captivity, a ruler sharpened in foreign halls, a sovereign who built a city from his own name, who bent kings to his will without ever raising his voice. But history rarely allows such peace to last, because the same traits that had carried him to greatness, ambition, confidence, vision would soon be tested by forces far more disciplined and unrelenting than any he had ever faced. For across the western hills, the Roman legions were coming, and they would not be appeased. There are cities in history that rise not merely from necessity, but from vision, not simply for defense or trade, but to project a legacy, a dream, a monument in stone to the ambitions of a man who saw beyond borders and seasons. For Tigranes, that dream took the form of Tigranocerta, a city born not from centuries of evolution, but from a singular will. It was somewhere around 80 BCE when he ordered it built, its name meaning simply the fortress of Tigranes. The location was chosen carefully, situated in the heart of Mesopotamia's fertile embrace. Here, where rivers whispered in ancient tongues and caravans drifted in from all corners of the known world, he would create a city worthy of his title, King of Kings. Tigranocerta was no ordinary capital. It was to be a symbol, a beacon of his empire's power, culture, and future. And so, artisans and architects were summoned from Greece, Persia, and even distant Syria. Marble was brought from afar. Statues in the Hellenistic style adorned the plazas. Theaters were built in the Greco-Roman tradition, large enough to hold thousands, echoing with the verses of Euripides and the music of flutes. Here, Tigranes wasn't merely an Armenian monarch. He was something more, something closer to Alexander than to the mountain chieftains of old. But such grandeur came at a cost. In order to populate the new city quickly, Tigranes used a method both ancient and brutal. He forcibly relocated entire populations, merchants, nobles, artisans from conquered cities, from Cappadocia, from Adiabene, from Assyria and Commagene. People were uprooted and brought to Tigranocerta, often against their will. It was a practice not uncommon in ancient times. The Assyrians had done the same, but for those who lived it, it meant loss of homes, of shrines, of familiar hills and waters. Yet, under the king's vast vision, their suffering was woven into a monument destined to shine across Asia. Tigranocerta soon bloomed into one of the richest cities in the East. Markets bustled with goods from India, Parthia, and the Aegean. Gold and silver flowed through its treasury. Scholars debated in the porticos, blending Greek philosophy with Eastern mysticism. Languages danced across the streets: Aramaic, Greek, Armenian, Parthian, each a thread in the empire's complex tapestry. And at its heart stood the palace of Tigranes himself, a place not only of governance, but of reflection. Lavish, certainly, with mosaics and colonnades and gardens that mirrored the heavens, but also stern in its symmetry, orderly, deliberate. Here, Tigranes received emissaries from Parthia and Rome, from distant Arabia and the shores of the Black Sea. They came to negotiate, to flatter, to fear. For a time, it worked. From this golden city, Tigranes ruled an empire as wealthy as it was vast, as culturally rich as it was militarily strong. But always there was the shadow, the distant sound of Roman boots across Anatolia, the whisper of ambition from across the sea, and closer still, the subtle resistance of those forced into this grand dream, citizens who saw the palace walls not as symbols of greatness, but as reminders of exile. And yet, it's hard not to admire it. To close your eyes and imagine walking through the grand colonnades of Tigranes, hearing music drift from the open-air theater, watching scribes etch laws in stone, the scent of myrrh from the temples, the murmurs of foreign merchants haggling over silk and spices. A city like a painting, vivid, intricate, majestic. But cities, like empires, are fragile. And history, ever patient, was already preparing its test. In the West, Rome had begun to feel the sting of Eastern defiance. Lucullus, seasoned and ambitious, now saw Tigranes not merely as a regional monarch, but as a direct obstacle to Roman dominance. His eyes turned eastward, and with him the legions. Tigranes, perhaps intoxicated by the glow of his golden city, underestimated the Roman threat. He had numbers, yes. He had wealth, terrain, even morale. But Rome had something else. Relentlessness. And so, even as Tigranes gleamed in the Mesopotamian sun, its foundations had already begun to tremble. For history does not pause to admire beauty. It moves with slow certainty toward balance. And now that balance had begun to tilt. Tigranes, the dreamer, the builder, the king of kings, would soon face a challenge not in building, but in defending, with the golden walls of his shining capital hold. Or would they become another ruin in the long scroll of forgotten empires? We'll cross into that storm next. Autumn came with the scent of dust and iron. In the west, Rome stirred restless and bruised from its long conflicts with Mithridates VI of Pontus. Lucius Licinius Lucullus, a man of stern discipline and calculated pride, had long since tired of this drawn-out war. Yet in his mind, victory was never partial. He did not simply wish to defeat Mithridates. He wanted to dismantle the Eastern alliance that protected him. And that meant war with Tigranes the Great. News traveled slow, but sure. Tigranes had granted refuge to Mithridates, his father-in-law, offering him safety in the eastern stretches of Armenia. To Rome, this was not hospitality, it was defiance. So Lucullus gathered his legions. They were no ordinary troops. These were hardened veterans of campaigns in Greece and Asia Minor, disciplined and battle-worn. Each soldier carried more than a gladius and shield. He carried the pride of a republic determined to remind the East of Rome's unshakable will. The march began from Cappadocia. Across mountains, rivers, and forgotten trails, they came not with haste, but with relentless rhythm. Like a tide that knows no fatigue, Lucullus moved with confidence, bolstered by intelligence reports and the belief that Armenia, though vast, was vulnerable. Tigranes, for his part, did not rush. He had built an empire that stretched beyond comprehension, and perhaps he had come to believe it was unassailable. When he first heard of Lucullus' approach, he is said to have laughed, remarking, "If the Romans come, they will fight in a land where I can summon armies as numerous as the sands." But Tigranes miscalculated, not in numbers, but in momentum. Rome's strength was never merely in its legions. It was in the cold precision of its commanders, in the unity of its ranks, and in its deep knowledge of the psychology of war. As Lucullus crossed into Armenian territory, city after city fell before Tigranes could organize his scattered forces. The Roman general did not pause to negotiate or posture. His goal was singular: strike directly at the heart Tigranocerta. By this time, the capital was still young and unfortified. It had grown rapidly, glittered with foreign wealth, but lacked the aged stone and seasoned walls that come only with time. When news arrived that Lucullus approached, panic rippled through the city like wind through silk. The people, many of them forcibly relocated from their original homelands, did not have the fierce loyalty of native defenders. Whispers of rebellion stirred beneath the marble facades, murmurs of betrayal, of hope in the Romans. Tigranes began to mobilize. Messengers galloped across his empire, summoning troops from Media, Syria, and the Armenian heartlands. His army began to assemble, vast in number, reportedly over 100,000 men, infantry, cavalry, archers, and even war elephants brought in from distant allies. Lucullus had only a fraction of that, roughly 15,000, 20,000 legionnaires. But where Tigranes had scale, Lucullus had speed, cohesion, and unshakable morale. As the two armies began to converge near Tigranocerta, a chill settled over the plains. Autumn's golden breath dried the grass, and every tree seemed to brace itself for the blow to come. The battle of Tigranocerta was inevitable, but before the swords clashed, there was a silence, a pause, a moment stretched taut between two worlds, east and west, ancient and rising. For the Armenians, this was a defense of legacy, of homeland, and of pride. For Rome, it was an assertion of dominance, a message that no refuge could be offered without consequence. And Lucullus, he was not merely fighting a king. He was fighting a myth, a man named King of Kings. Yet in his eyes, Tigranes was no god, just another obstacle between him and Rome's supremacy in the east. On the dawn of battle, Tigranes stood tall, adorned in his royal armor, a cloak of deep crimson brushing the earth. Behind him, the hills were lined with soldiers, rows upon rows, a sea of spears and hope. And across the plain, Lucullus stood with calm eyes, giving orders in hushed tones, his men already forming tight, precise lines. The Romans, though outnumbered, were undaunted. And then the dust rose, the horns blew, and history shattered the silence. The battle began, and in the chaos of war, dreams were tested, empires strained, and destinies bent like blades. But what happened next? Was it Tigranes who would hold his line and defend the city he had built stone by stone? Or would the legions carve their names into the very foundations of Tigranes? The answer lies in the heat of that day, where kings bled and gods fell silent. Let's step into that battle next. Morning broke over the plains of Tigranes, heavy with anticipation and stillness that felt unnatural. The sun's low rays brushed against spear tips like fire on steel. On one side stood the mighty host of Tigranes the Great, his banners fluttering like painted sails against a golden sky, his cavalry shimmering under ornamental armor, their horses restless and sweating in the autumn air. On the other side, far fewer in number, the Roman lines waited in grim silence, steel gray, motionless, their discipline stretched like a bowstring before the first shot. The Battle of Tigranes was not simply a clash of armies, it was the convergence of worlds. Tigranes commanded a force that was, by every account, overwhelming. Massive columns of infantry flanked by swift horsemen from Armenia, and the steppes, backed by foreign auxiliaries and mercenaries. But despite the size, despite the glimmering pageantry of his army, there was a quiet fracture at its core. The people defending Tigranes were not all loyal. Many had been forced from their homelands to populate the city. Their allegiance was not to the Armenian king, but to survival. And survival, on that day, began to whisper Rome's name. Lucullus, standing at the head of his much smaller force, understood this. He was no stranger to being outnumbered. His strength was in understanding terrain, morale, and momentum. He did not fear Tigranes' numbers. He feared only delay. As the wind carried the sharp scent of sweat and leather across the fields, Lucullus acted first. He led a flanking maneuver with a select group of veteran soldiers, men he trusted like limbs of his own body. They moved swiftly across a ridge that overlooked the left flank of Tigranes' formation. Tigranes, confident in his numbers, allowed his center to march forward, pushing against the Roman infantry. For a moment, it seemed as though the weight of sheer manpower might crush the legionaries. But Lucullus had seen this before in Asia Minor, in Bithynia, in Phrygia. He had studied Tigranes like a chess player studies a hasty opponent. The Romans formed a wedge, their shields clattering in rhythmic unison. With deliberate calm, they absorbed the initial shock, then pushed forward with cold determination. Arrows from Armenian archers fell like hailstones, but the Roman testudo held strong. And then, from the ridge, Lucullus himself led the flank assault. It was swift, surgical. The Armenian lines began to splinter, not from lack of bravery, but from lack of unity. Mercenaries broke first, men who fought for coin, not cause. The cavalry wheeled too late, unable to recover the rhythm of their charge. In the chaos, word spread false or true. None could tell that the city of Tigranes had already begun to revolt, that gates had opened, that Roman agents were inside the walls. Fear is more powerful than any blade, and it spread like wildfire. Tigranes, atop a white charger, watched as confusion crept into the hearts of his men. He tried to rally them. His voice thundered across the plain, but the tide had shifted. He had fought too far from the loyalty of his homeland, too deep into a city whose stones had not yet learned to love him. The Roman centurions pressed forward, shouting Latin commands with cold precision. Every step they took seemed inevitable, like stones falling downhill. Then the unthinkable happened. The left wing of Tigranes' army collapsed. Men fled, first in trickles, then in waves. Tigranes, unwilling to watch his royal army disintegrate before his eyes, made the decision that every king dreads. He ordered a retreat. Lucullus, victorious, but cautious, did not pursue immediately. He let the fear do the work. The battlefield was littered with broken lances, crushed helmets, and the echo of panic. And in the midst of it all, Tigranocerta, a city built by royal decree, adorned with stolen beauty, and meant to be the jewel of the East, opened its gates. The people, weary and unwilling to die for a dream they did not share, welcomed the Romans not as conquerors, but as liberators. It is said that Lucullus entered the city not with bloodlust, but with admiration. He walked its wide avenues and gazed upon its new marble, its palaces, its theaters, and marveled at what ambition had built and fear had surrendered. Tigranes retreated eastward, his dreams wounded but not dead. He would not be destroyed by this one loss. Yet the illusion of invincibility had been shattered. The title of King of Kings now felt more fragile, more hollow. For Rome, the victory was resounding, but even Lucullus knew it was not the end. Tigranes still held the highlands, the old capital, the loyalty of his people in the heart of Armenia. He was not finished. He was bruised, not broken. And so, even as the Roman banners flew above Tigranocerta, and Lucullus allowed his men to rest, the general knew another campaign would be required. Because kings like Tigranes, those who rise through vision and fire, they do not vanish in a single defeat. They retreat into the mountains, gather breath, and sharpen their swords. What would Tigranes do next? Would he fall further, or would he strike back from the shadows of Ararat? There is more to his story. Let's follow him into the hills and see what remained of his will to fight. The winds that swept across the Armenian highlands carried more than just the chill of elevation. They bore the silence of retreat, the pain of wounded pride, and the questions that follow every fall from greatness. Tigranes had fled Tigranocerta, not as a broken man, but as a king forced back into the embrace of his true homeland. The plains had betrayed him. The city, his greatest project, had surrendered too soon. But the mountains, these eternal stones that had watched empires come and go, they still belonged to him. He rode northeast, through narrow passes that wound like veins across the highlands. Around him, remnants of his royal guard rode in silence. Their numbers were smaller, but their hearts more loyal than those mercenaries who had scattered on the field. These men had bled for Armenia long before it was wealthy. They knew that Tigranes, though wounded, was still king. The roads grew steeper. Pines lined the cliffs, and streams trickled beside old Roman watchposts long abandoned. Here, in the raw wilderness of the Armenian soul, the king began to breathe again. Tigranes returned to Artaxata, his ancestral capital, nestled between the rivers Araxes and Metsemer. Unlike Tigranocerta, Artaxata did not dazzle with Greek architecture or marble colonnades. Its streets were narrow, its stones worn, but its loyalty was ancient. Here, the people gathered without orders. They stood in courtyards and temple squares to see their king return, not in triumph, but in dignity. There were no jeers, no cries of blame, only quiet understanding. In a world of shifting alliances and fragile oaths, this was what Tigranes had that Rome did not: roots. He took counsel in a fortress overlooking the Araxes, surrounded by trusted nobles, generals, and messengers from distant provinces. Reports trickled in. Some cities still held firm. Others had turned. Lucullus had taken the plains, yes, but the heartland, the highlands, and the mountain tribes remained loyal. The Romans, skilled though they were, could not breathe as easily here, and neither could they march swiftly. Tigranes, though grieving the loss of Tigranocerta, began to plan. He understood what few kings truly grasp after a defeat: how to listen again. He met with village elders from the southern ridges, heard the counsel of horse lords from Lake Van, and reconnected with the pulse of the land he once left behind to chase empire. He sent envoys to the Parthians, tentative feelers, for his earlier rivalry had not been forgotten. But more importantly, he reached out once more to Mithridates VI of Pontus. Though Lucullus had struck them both, the bond between these two great enemies of Rome still flickered. In hardship, it began to burn anew. In the months that followed, the Armenian king did not sleep idly in palaces. He moved between camps. He rode with the cavalry. He learned which regions could raise men again. His spies reported Roman movements. Lucullus was wintering, stretched thin in unfamiliar land, and facing unrest in his own ranks. Rome had struck hard, but it had not struck deep. And in that space between a battle lost and a campaign unfinished, Tigranes began to rebuild. The mountains taught patience. The snow came early that year, blanketing the passes and making the Roman lines sluggish. Where Lucullus had once swept through valleys with iron force, now he found himself slowed by unfamiliar geography and the biting cold of a land that did not welcome him. Roman supply lines were long and brittle. Harassment from Armenian riders, skilled in ambush and evasion, began to cut them off. Not in grand battles, but in 1,000 little wounds. Tigranes had once stood atop a vast, gleaming empire. Now, he moved like a fox in the trees. But in that shift, he rediscovered something primal, something vital. He had become too much a king of cities, of spectacle. Now, once again, he became a king of people, of terrain, of memory. By spring, he was ready to test his strength again, not with another pitched battle, no. He would not repeat Tigranes, but with shadow wars, skirmishes, strategic raids that bled the Romans slowly. He harassed Lucullus foraging parties, burned abandoned forts to deny shelter, spread false rumors of massive armies approaching from the north. And always, he kept the Romans guessing. Lucullus, frustrated and fatigued, pushed toward Artaxata. He sought to crush Tigranes in his birthplace, to sever Armenia at its root. But the king was ready. He drew Lucullus in with promises of engagement, then melted away into the hills. Every step the Romans took deeper into Armenia was a step into territory more loyal to Tigranes. And with every mile, the Armenian forces grew. Lucullus' soldiers, veterans though they were, began to falter, not from wounds, but from weariness. They had marched far beyond their comfort, beyond their maps. And their general, brilliant though he was, could not conjure loyalty where there was only duty. Tigranes watched it unfold from high ridges. His scouts brought him news daily. He did not strike too soon. He waited, observed. Let the snowmelt flood the valleys. Let the rivers swell. And then he moved. In a night assault on a Roman outpost near Lake Sevan, Armenian cavalry struck with precision and fire. Tents burned, supply wagons overturned. And though the loss was not catastrophic, it was symbolic. Rome could be wounded here. The message was clear. Tigranes was not finished. Though he had lost his crown city, he had not lost his crown. Though he had stumbled, he had risen not in marble halls, but in the forests and frost of his true kingdom. This time, he would not make the mistake of trusting stone walls and distant provinces. This time, he would fight as his ancestors had in the land they knew better than any map could show. Rome had stepped too far, too confidently. And now the mountains would answer. What came next was a new kind of war, a war not just of armies, but of patience, weather, and will. Would Lucullus press on? Would Rome keep chasing shadows through unfamiliar lands? Or would the hunter become the hunted? Let us follow that thread into the next storm, and watch how the empire that seemed invincible began to feel the strain of its reach. The Romans, for all their mastery in war, were not gods. Their legions, though forged in the fires of countless campaigns, were still composed of men who bled, who tired, and who, in the farthest reaches of the known world, began to doubt. Lucullus had marched with glory. He had entered Armenia as the avenger of Rome, the breaker of kings. But as the months passed, and the grandeur of his victories faded into the cold bite of highland winds and logistical nightmares, the limits of his campaign began to show. His soldiers had followed him through Pontus, across the Euphrates, and into the shadow of Mount Ararat. But now they marched with leaden feet. The endless roads through valleys and ridges wore down not only their sandals, but their will. They had expected to crush a nation, to take Tigranes in chains. Instead, they found themselves in a land that did not yield. Armenia did not fight in straight lines. Its resistance came like the frost, silent, numbing, creeping in from every crevice. By the time Lucullus neared Artaxata, his army was exhausted. His supply lines were overextended. Armenian cavalry had torched his granaries, poisoned wells, and intercepted caravans. The once proud Roman columns grew thin. Horses starved. Morale collapsed in whispers, and Tigranes watched. He did not confront Lucullus directly. He let the mountains do his bidding. He let hunger fight his war. The high passes choked with snow. Men died not with swords in their bellies, but with ice on their beards. When Lucullus attempted to force a battle near the capital, he found no enemy, only ghost trails, false fires in the distance, the howls of wolves where there should have been war cries. Artaxata remained elusive, and so the Romans turned south again, frustrated and shivering, carrying the weight of unrealized conquest. Lucullus could feel the empire slipping through his fingers. Each decision now seemed to carry not triumph, but consequences. Back in Rome, whispers had already begun. Some senators questioned his endless campaign. Others wondered why a general who had defeated Mithridates and stormed Tigranocerta could not finish the job. Lucullus was no longer a rising star. He was becoming a cautionary tale. And in his own camp, the seeds of discontent had sprouted fully. His officers grumbled. His soldiers no longer marched with reverence, but with resentment. They saw no gold, no land, no glory, only more hills to climb and more storms to endure. Meanwhile, Mithridates had reemerged, that indomitable spirit of Pontus, once driven into hiding, returned like a phantom. With Tigranes regaining strength in the mountains, Mithridates launched renewed attacks in his old territories, drawing Roman forces back toward the Black Sea. Lucullus now faced a war on two fronts, but without the will of his army to support him. He sent orders, some went ignored. He demanded fortifications, none were built. He needed loyalty, but got fatigue. In desperation, Lucullus attempted a final push back toward the southern provinces, hoping to secure supplies and regain momentum. But the Armenians harried him at every step. What once took weeks now took months. What once brought fear now brought laughter from the hills. He was no longer the hunter. He had become the hunted. In one chilling episode, Roman scouts disappeared entirely. Their bodies were found days later, strung between pine trunks with Armenian arrows in their chests. It was not just a message, it was a reminder. This was not Roman land, and it would never be. Tigranes, watching from afar, began to smile again. He had outlived their plans. He had outlasted their siege. The cities may have fallen, but the spirit of Armenia remained unbroken. And as Lucullus retreated further into confusion, Tigranes grew bold once more. Not yet to attack, No, he was wiser now, but he began reuniting his scattered forces. Old allies who had once abandoned him now returned. Even those who had doubted him after Tigranes began to speak his name with reverence again. The phoenix, it seemed, was rising from its ashes. And so, Lucullus faced the worst enemy of all, time. For in time, his enemies grew stronger. In time, his name grew fainter. And in time, the Senate in Rome began looking for someone else, someone younger, someone more decisive. And they found him, Pompey the Great. The Senate ordered Lucullus recalled. His command transferred to the rising general, whose fame had already eclipsed many in Rome. It was not an immediate dismissal, but for Lucullus, it felt like exile. After all his victories, after all his conquests, he would not even be allowed to finish what he started. The bitter taste of politics reached even the cold Armenian air, and as he prepared to withdraw, Lucullus looked one last time at the horizon, at the mountains that had swallowed his ambition, at the snow-covered valleys that refused to bow. He had come as a conqueror. He left as a reminder that even Rome, for all its glory, could falter, that even Rome could find limits. Tigranes stood once again, scarred, yes, and humbled, but standing. He had not defeated Lucullus in open battle, but he had done something far rarer. He had endured him, and in the East, that endurance was worth more than any sword. Now, with Lucullus fading and Pompey approaching, the game would change again. Would Tigranes finally meet a rival capable of finishing what Lucullus began? Or would the King of Kings find yet another path through the smoke and shadows? Let us walk that path next into the era of Pompey and the final test of Armenia's defiance. The year was 66 BCE, and the East stirred once again, not with fear this time, but with the careful breath one takes before a storm. In the distance, a new figure approached, calm, composed, and carrying the authority of the Roman Senate in his every stride. His name was Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus. History would remember him as Pompey the Great. Unlike Lucullus, whose campaign had frayed into the frost-covered silence of the Armenian highlands, Pompey came not just as a general, but as an administrator, a tactician, a man who understood that wars were not only won by swords, but by timing, alliances, and perception. He had a reputation that glowed in Rome like a beacon. He had crushed pirates in a matter of months and tamed chaos in Syria. He did not rush to Armenia with blind ambition. He approached with method. Tigranes, now older, perhaps wiser, ruled a kingdom that had survived, but not thrived. His empire, once stretching from the Mediterranean to the Caspian, had shrunk like a tide, pulling back into the sea. And yet, within his palace at Artaxata, the flicker of royal pride still burned. He was not yet ready to yield, not to Rome, not to time. But he was also not blind. He had watched Lucullus falter. He had watched Mithridates retreat and reappear like smoke. And he had watched his own strength flicker. Now, he waited for Pompey to reveal his hand. Pompey, for his part, understood the terrain he entered. He studied Lucullus's mistakes. He respected the endurance of Tigranes, the cunning of Mithridates, and the treacherous loyalties of the East. He moved swiftly, but not arrogantly, securing the Syrian coastline, cutting off Tigranes from outside help, and then quietly, surgically, beginning to isolate the king himself. But what changed everything was not a battle, nor a speech, nor even a strategy. It was blood. Tigranes the Younger, the son of the King of Kings, once held hostage in Rome, had been set free and returned not as an heir, but as a rival. With Roman encouragement, he began assembling an army of rebels, discontented nobles, and mercenaries hungry for gold. He stormed into Armenian territory, not as a prince coming home, but as a conqueror wearing a familiar name. The betrayal was absolute. To Tigranes the Great, this was not war. This was personal. His own son, his own blood, had become the sword that now pressed against his throat. And it was Pompey who had handed him the blade. As the two Tigranes, father and son, clashed, Armenia wept. Cities were forced to choose loyalties. Fortresses switched banners under the cover of darkness. Families were torn between fear and duty. But the elder king, though bruised, was not ready to fall. In a swift and decisive move, he struck against his son's forces near the city of Artaxata. The battle was not long, but it was bitter. Father faced son not on a field of glory, but in the muddy outskirts of home. The younger Tigranes was defeated, captured, and brought before his father in chains. One might have expected mercy, or a speech, or silence. Instead, Tigranes the Great looked upon his son, and with an iron gaze that masked an ocean of sorrow, sentenced him to death. The execution was swift, and with it, something else died, perhaps a piece of the king's soul. It was, at this moment, historians later agreed, that Tigranes ceased to be a ruler of dreams and became a ruler of survival. Pompey, watching from the borders, knew the timing was perfect. He marched into Armenian territory, not with legions alone, but with diplomacy. He sent envoys, not war drums, and what he offered Tigranes was not subjugation, but a compromise. Recognize Rome as your superior. Relinquish all claims beyond Armenia proper. Pay a steep indemnity, and you may keep your throne. It was a dagger disguised as an olive branch. But after years of war, betrayal, and loss, Tigranes saw it for what it was, a final chance to preserve his kingdom from utter extinction. In 66 BCE, the King of Kings did something no one expected. He submitted. Before Pompey, in a carefully orchestrated ceremony, he removed his crown and laid it at the Roman's feet. He was then given the crown back, not as a sovereign emperor, but as a client king of Rome. A shadow of his former majesty, but a king nonetheless. Pompey accepted graciously, but with Roman pride intact. In Rome, this was hailed as a triumph. Pompey had done what Lucullus could not. He had ended the Eastern War without a single drawn-out siege. He had tamed Mithridates, humbled Tigranes, and secured the region for Roman interests. In Armenia, however, the whispers were quieter, more mournful. The great expansion, the glory of the East, the dream of a kingdom that could rival Rome, it had all ended not with a fall, but with a bow. Yet, in that bow was dignity. Tigranes had outlived Mithridates, had endured Lucullus, and had kept his throne under impossible odds. He had ruled an empire, fought for its soul, and chosen preservation over annihilation. And in his final years, he ruled a smaller Armenia, but a stable one. He restored trade. He rebuilt fortresses. He ensured that his lineage, though marred by tragedy, would continue. He walked his gardens in Artaxata not as a god-king, but as a man who had walked through fire and come out alive. Pompey returned to Rome, basked in parades and praise, but in the East, the name of Tigranes still lingered, not as a man who lost, but as a man who survived what few ever could. The story of his reign, of empires dreamed and diminished, was not yet over, because even in peace, history watches. And in the final breath of his reign, Tigranes would look westward, not with regret, but with a faint, unshakable smile. He had lived to see the end of it all, but would that peace truly last? Let us step into those final years, into reflection, into legacy, and into the echoes of a kingdom that once stretched to the ends of the world. The winds that once howled across the Armenian highlands with the drums of conquest had quieted. In the capital of Artaxata, the stone walls no longer trembled with the march of armies, and the bronze horns of war lay forgotten, collecting dust in the shadows of old chambers. Time had slowed its pace, and with it, so too had the man once hailed as the King of Kings. Tigranes the Great, in his twilight years, walked through a world that no longer bowed at his name, but still remembered it, though Rome's shadow now stretched across his borders. It could not erase the mark he had left, nor could it extinguish the quiet pride that lingered behind his aging eyes. He had once commanded one of the most powerful empires in the East, stretching from the Euphrates to the gates of Egypt, his banners rippling over cities whose names echoed with myth. Now his kingdom was reduced to Armenia proper, modest, remote, yet still sovereign and still his. For a man who had flown so high, the descent had not ended in ashes, but in something gentler, a subdued dignity, shaped by experience and softened by time. Tigranes had lived long enough to become a legend in his own lifetime. That alone was rare. Most conquerors fade in the violence that crowns them, but he endured. And in that endurance, there was something profoundly human. In the evenings, it is said, he would walk the gardens outside the palace, the same courtyards that once heard the laughter of his children, the soft footfall of diplomats, and the hurried steps of messengers. Now heard only the crunch of his sandals upon gravel. He no longer issued decrees of war or dreamed of Mediterranean harbors. He oversaw roads, irrigation, the rebuilding of temples. His focus turned inward, toward the land itself, toward stability. The people of Armenia, those who had suffered during years of endless war and shifting frontiers, now tasted something rare, peace. And though it had come under the terms of a foreign power, it was their king who had secured it. To them, Tigranes was no longer the conqueror, but the guardian, the one who had held the line when the world threatened to swallow their nation whole. Rome watched him from afar. Pompey had departed, and others now managed the eastern provinces. But Tigranes was left in place, not because Rome feared him, but because it respected the silence he now kept. He was no longer a threat, and perhaps, in some quiet chamber of the Senate, he was even admired. Within his court, however, memories lingered. The betrayal of his son had cut deeply, though Tigranes the younger had paid with his life. The wound never fully closed. Tigranes had other sons, but none who had stood so close to the crown. There was caution now in the old king's heart, a reluctance to elevate any too quickly, as if fearing history would repeat its cruel design. One son, Artavasdes, began to rise quietly, trained not for glory, but for diplomacy. Under Tigranes' weary but watchful eye, Artavasdes was groomed not to expand the kingdom, but to preserve it. It was a different kind of inheritance. As the king aged, the burdens of his past became heavier, not in regret, but in remembrance. In the great hall of Artaxata, where once emissaries from Parthia, Pontus, and even Rome had gathered, there now hung maps of an empire that no longer existed. Each line, each city, each mountain pass was a memory, not a failure, a memory. There were nights, it is said, when the stars above the palace seemed to flicker more brightly, reminding Tigranes of campaigns long past. The siege of Antioch, the parades in Nineveh, the moment he placed a crown upon the head of Mithridates' daughter. His glory had been real, his power immense. But all things pass. What remained was legacy, and that, he began to understand, could not be built by conquest alone. So he turned to the scholars. He reopened libraries, invited Greek philosophers, Babylonian astronomers, and Armenian scribes to gather under his protection. He encouraged the recording of history, not just of his own deeds, but of the ancient Armenian lineage, of the gods, the myths, the mountains. He wanted Armenia to remember not just him, but itself, and in doing so, he laid a different kind of foundation, one not built upon conquest, but upon culture. A memory that could not be erased by legions or treaties. Tigranes would live into his 80s, a remarkable age for a king whose life had been measured in battles and betrayals. When the end came, it came softly, not with a blade or a siege, but with a final breath upon a dawn mist. He died in Artaxata, surrounded by those who had remained loyal through everything. His body was adorned not with gold or jewels, but with the simple robe of an old king who had seen too much, and yet still chosen to lead. He was buried near the capital, and over time, his tomb became a place of quiet pilgrimage. Not a grand mausoleum to rival the pyramids or palaces of the West, but a place where shepherds and travelers would pause, remove their hats, and remember, because Tigranes had ruled not just a kingdom, but a moment in time. A rare moment when Armenia had stood at the center of the world. And even though the sun had set on his empire, the glow of that moment lingered, like the last warmth of twilight on a cold mountain peak. He had been a king of kings, and in the silence that followed him, history listened. But though Tigranes now rested, the world he shaped would not remain still for long. New alliances would form, Rome's grip would tighten, and his son, Artaxerxes, would soon face choices that would test whether the legacy of his father could survive the changing winds of fate. The crown of Armenia did not pass with thunder nor resistance, but in a hush, the kind of silence that lingers after a storm. Tigranes the Great had gone, and in his place rose Artaxerxes II, his son, raised not for war but for endurance. Artaxerxes stood at the foot of his father's tomb longer than the priests expected. The new king said nothing that morning, not to his guards, not to his council. He simply stood there, his cloak gathering the mist that curled over the hills of Artaxata, as if he were trying to hear the echo of his father's last thoughts, still drifting in the mountain air. He did not wear his father's armor. That legacy was too heavy now. The Armenia he inherited was no longer a force that could shake empires, but it was still proud, and it still stood, thanks to the man who came before him. But pride is a delicate thing in the world of empires. To the west, Rome watched. To the south, Parthia waited. And to the east, the restless tribes stirred. Artaxerxes was no fool. He knew that his kingship would not be one of conquest, but of survival. The court was quiet at first. The nobles who had once rallied behind Tigranes' grand campaigns were aging, or had long since turned their gaze inward, building estates and securing their bloodlines. Artaxerxes understood that power now came not from the sword, but from wit, from timing, from knowing when to kneel and when to speak. He was a scholar, first and foremost, fluent in Greek. He had studied Aristotle and the epics, debated with philosophers in the halls of the palace, and dreamed more of theater than of war. Under his rule, Armenia's court began to resemble a symposium rather than a war council. Scrolls replaced swords on marble tables. Playwrights visited from Antioch and Athens, and the arts, long dimmed by the flames of war, flickered back to life. Yet the world did not stop spinning for poetry. In 53 BCE, the air grew heavy again. Rome, ever restless, sent forth a man whose ambition was as wide as the deserts he dared to cross. Marcus Licinius Crassus, a member of the first triumvirate. Crassus sought to rival the glories of Caesar in Gaul and Pompey in the east by claiming the Parthian Empire for Rome. And to do so, He needed safe passage through Armenia. He called upon Artavasdes, offering an alliance, a marriage pact, and the promise of shared victory. But Artavasdes hesitated. He knew Crassus lacked the military brilliance of Caesar and the cautious diplomacy of Pompey. There was something reckless in the Romans' eyes, too much pride, not enough caution. And Tigranes had taught him, pride could undo a kingdom faster than any army. Artavasdes offered advice. He warned Crassus not to invade through the Mesopotamian lowlands, where Parthian cavalry would rule. He suggested an alternative route through Armenia, using the high passes where Roman infantry would have the advantage. Crassus refused. He believed in brute force. And so, Crassus marched directly into Parthia. The Battle of Carrhae would follow, a disaster so complete that it would echo across centuries. Over 20,000 Roman soldiers were killed. Crassus himself was captured. And in a bitter act of symbolic mockery, executed by having molten gold poured down his throat, Parthia's commentary on Rome's greed. Artavasdes, far from the battlefield, watched and waited. His hands were clean, his advice ignored. Yet he knew Rome would not forget this, and they didn't. In the years that followed, Rome turned inward in civil war, but it never forgot the East. And when Mark Antony rose to power, he brought with him a renewed vision, one that once again required Armenia to either submit or cooperate. Antony was different from Crassus, more calculating, but also more theatrical. He sought alliances through pageantry and marriage. And Artavasdes once again was drawn into the orbit of empire. Antony married Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, and saw himself not as a Roman general, but as a new Alexander. To Artavasdes, this was dangerous delusion. Yet diplomacy demanded performance. Artavasdes offered support to Antony in his renewed campaign against Parthia. But once again, the Parthians proved too swift, too elusive, too hardened by their desert frontiers. Antony's campaign faltered, and as it did, he turned his frustration inward toward Armenia. In 34 BCE, Antony marched on Artaxata. Artavasdes had done nothing openly wrong. He had not betrayed the Roman, but Antony needed a scapegoat, someone to display in Alexandria beside Cleopatra to maintain the illusion of power. So he took Artavasdes and his family prisoner, marched them in chains, and paraded them in a mock triumph. There, in a foreign land, the son of Tigranes, once heir to an empire, stood bound in gold before an Egyptian queen and a Roman lover who saw kingship as theater. It was a moment of humiliation, not just for Artavasdes, but for Armenia, and yet he bore it with silence. No pleas, no cries, only eyes that remembered every word his father had spoken, every scroll he had studied, every line of tragedy he had ever read. He was executed some years later, likely at Cleopatra's command. A quiet, political end to a quiet, thoughtful king, but Artavasdes' legacy did not die with him. For though Rome had taken his life, it could not undo what he had done. He had kept Armenia intact, nurtured its soul, and ensured that even in the age of steel and empire, his people would remember who they were, not conquerors, perhaps, but survivors, keepers of memory. As the sun set over Alexandria and rose again over Artaxata, his name passed into legend, carried not by bards of empire, but by the stones of his homeland, by the songs whispered in mountain villages, and the pages of forgotten chronicles. Artavasts had ruled in the shadow of giants, and in doing so became something rare, a bridge between eras, between blood and ink. And yet, Armenia's trials were far from over. The death of Artavast's II did not silence the heartbeat of Armenia, but it did slow its rhythm. With the fall of the Tigranid kings into the hands of empires, Armenia now stood as a nation not wholly free, nor entirely bound. Its fate, like the mist that clings to its hills, was neither captured nor dispersed, only suspended. In the years that followed, Rome and Parthia, the great juggernauts of the West and East, continued their long chess game, and Armenia became a square on that board. Each move, each treaty, each betrayal, they all came with a price, and that price was often paid in Armenian blood, on Armenian soil. And yet, something remarkable happened. Armenia did not disappear. Where other small nations were swallowed whole by the appetites of empires, Armenia held. Sometimes as a client kingdom, sometimes as a rebellious province, sometimes merely as a name whispered among ruins, but it held. The reason, perhaps, lies not in walls or warriors, but in the strange, enduring flame left behind by Tigranes the Great and those who came after him. That flame was identity, even as Rome installed new kings on Armenian thrones, men with names foreign to the highlands, loyal more to Caesars than to their people. Something within the soul of Armenia resisted. Farmers still plowed the same earth where Tigranes had once ridden. Priests still lit fires in temples where gods older than Rome still waited in silence. And mothers still told their children of the king who had once ruled from sea to sea, the king who had brought libraries and freedom and pride. The name Tigranes became less a man and more a myth. In Parthian courts, Armenian nobles continued to serve, always with eyes looking homeward. In Roman histories, Armenia was a footnote, but among the Armenians themselves, it was everything. Their kings may have bowed, but their stories never did. By the 1st century AD, Armenia would find itself pulled ever tighter between Rome and Parthia. At times, kings would switch allegiance like weather vanes in mountain wind. In 66 AD, the Roman Emperor Nero famously sent Tigranes VI to rule as Rome's puppet, an Armenian in name, but Roman in loyalty. And yet again, that name, Tigranes. Rome understood the symbolic power, even in their manipulation. They paid homage to something they could never quite erase. To rule Armenia, you had to speak its language, not just in words, but in memory. Still, beneath the quiet facade of diplomacy, the ground always stirred. There were revolts, rebellions, small fires that flared and vanished. Armenia's people had become masters of survival, not through conquest, but through endurance. They learned to bend without breaking. The Tigranid line itself by blood dissipated with time. Intermarriages, assassinations, and political pawns diluted its pure descent. But the legend of Tigranes the Great remained untouched. It was no longer confined to genealogy. It was now embedded in stone inscriptions, in songs sung over campfires, in the scripts of monks who would one day record the earliest words in the Armenian language. Even Christianity, which would soon arrive like a whisper on the wind, could not erase the echo of Tigranes. By the early 4th century, Armenia would become the first nation in the world to adopt Christianity as a state religion, a new faith for a new world. But the soul of the nation remained a palimpsest. Behind every cross was still the outline of an eagle. Beneath every psalm, the rhythm of an ancient drum. And in that transition from pagan kings to Christian martyrs, the myth of Tigranes remained a foundation. He became not just a historical figure, but a symbol of a time when Armenia stood tall and alone, a reminder that identity could stretch across centuries, even if thrones cracked and crowns were scattered like dust. Travelers in later centuries would still see the remnants. The cities he had built, Tigranocerta and Artaxata, lay in ruins, but their names were remembered. His coins, struck with a proud profile and a sharp nose, were found buried in valleys where sheep now grazed, and his deeds, recorded by Greek, Roman, and Armenian scribes alike, were copied by candlelight in mountain monasteries, long after the world had forgotten his empire. To be Armenian, even under foreign rule, meant remembering that once there was a king who had stood between two worlds and carved his own. Remembering that even when the empires roared, Armenia had whispered its name into the wind, and the mountains had answered. And so Tigranes the Great, though long entombed, never truly died. His legacy was not in the gold he taxed or the lands he conquered, but in the pride he gave his people, in the idea that a small kingdom, nestled among ancient ridges, could defy time not with armies, but with spirit. And when the dust of empire finally settled, when Rome and Parthia both crumbled into history, the people of Armenia were still there, quiet, weathered, and still whispering the old names under the stars. But the journey does not end with memory, for there is still one final chapter to be told, a reflection not on kings or wars, but on what remains after the swords are sheathed and the world turns silent again, when all the kings are gone and the citadels lie broken beneath vines and wildflowers, when names once feared are now barely legible on crumbling stone. What remains for Armenia? What remains is something neither Rome nor Parthia could ever take, something that neither time nor tyranny could erase, a soul, a soul shaped by mountains and memory, by struggle and serenity, a soul born in the quiet endurance of a people who have watched the empires rise and fall like the tides, yet have never truly been swept away. Tigranes the Great was a man of ambition, strategy, and glory, but his true greatness did not lie in the width of his empire or the gold in his coffers. It lay in the roots he helped sink deeper into the Armenian earth, roots that would weather storm after storm, invasion after invasion, and still grow. As the centuries unfolded, Armenia would know sorrow again and again. Under Byzantine rule, Persian occupation, Arab invasions, Turkish incursions, and Soviet domination. Each time the land shook, borders changed, flags fluttered and fell. But within each Armenian heart, there remained a stubborn ember, a spark ignited in ancient times, when kings like Tigranes first declared that this highland soil would answer to no one but its own. You see, history often forgets the small. It records the conquerors, the generals, the emperors. But sometimes it misses the shepherds, the monks, the mothers, the quiet guardians of identity. And in Armenia, they remembered the golden days of Tigranosarta. They remembered the roar of the court, where languages from every corner of the known world had once echoed. They remembered the coins that bore the king's noble brow, and the roads that stretched like lifelines to the edges of the sea. They remembered, because remembering was a kind of resistance. Even as temples gave way to churches and kings to caliphs, the idea of a proud, sovereign Armenia remained like a seed waiting, always waiting, for the right season to rise again. And it did rise, again and again. Sometimes in rebellion, other times in poetry, sometimes in battlefields, other times in cathedrals carved into cliffs. Through the voice of Kmita's songs, through the endurance of monks writing manuscripts in candlelit caves, through the quiet strength of survivors, Armenia continued to tell its story, not always loudly, but always. Tigranes was not the beginning, nor was he the end. He was a crescendo in a symphony still being played, a brilliant flame in a long line of flickering torches, passed from hand to hand, century after century. Even today, his legacy breathes. In Yerevan's museums, where schoolchildren press their faces to glass cases, holding coins older than empires. In dusty bookshelves, where Armenian historians whisper to the past. In the stone khachkars, cross stones dotting the countryside, where ancient memory is carved not in words, but in symbols. And in the blood of a people who, despite exile and genocide, diaspora and despair, still rise, still speak their language, still call themselves Armenian. So, as we come to the end of our story tonight, think not of kings and crowns, but of echoes. The echo of a horse's gallop in the dusty plains of Mesopotamia. The echo of hammers building Tigranosarta, stone upon stone. The echo of a king's voice as he stood before his people and declared their place among nations. and the echo, perhaps most powerful of all, of silence. The silence that comes after empires fall, when only the mountains remain and the people who love them. As you drift into sleep, imagine those mountains. Feel the ancient winds brushing through the cypress trees. Hear the rustle of parchment as a scribe etches history into the skin of memory. Smell the incense of a forgotten temple. Taste the honeyed wine once poured in celebration of victory. This is not just a bedtime story. It is a living memory, a legacy carried through the centuries, not by swords or crowns, but by breath, by story. And now it is yours too. Thank you for walking through this ancient dream with me. Thank you for remembering. Sleep well, and may your dreams carry you across the highlands where kings once stood, where songs still echo, and where the soul of Armenia lives forever. Good night.